sweeps through the air, drawing circles in the dirt. Sunshine breathing life in colors, calibrating temperature, growing roots from the center of the sphere, glowing green and air is clear, spinning clouds like wheels, weaving words like silk, locking stories in the air, frozen melodies everywhere, holding words from your lips. I don't disagree. I wonder if you're real. I wonder if you're real.
Greetings, beloved. We are on location, sitting with the sister minister. And needless to say, we are excited and delighted to be at Hofstra University on the campus of, with the legendary Reverend Dr. William Barber II. And so we are happy to welcome him to Strong Island. And sir, happy to have you sitting with the sister minister today.
Thank you, Sister Minister. I almost found out we're cousins.
For sure, for sure. I've got a couple of quick things, Dr. Barber. We want to talk about Moral Mondays, which began in 2013. What was the impetus? What motivated you to be able to start that Moral Monday movement?
Well, it was actually rooted in about 9 years of organizing prior to that. We had made major progress in North Carolina around health care, raising the minimum wage, voting rights. We had become the only southern state that had same-day registration, early voting in North Carolina, something that's not even in New York.
Right, that's
and you
correct.
all are a northern state. Then we had an extremist legislature get elected in 2012 through gerrymandering and racial
right?
Republican. I call them extremists because they're not even Republican. My granddaddy was a Republican, but he was a Teddy Roosevelt Republican, a Lincoln Republican.
All right.
These folk are Tea Party extremists. And in the first 50 days, they went after everybody in the state. They denied 500,000 people Medicaid expansion. They cut money for public education. They went after women's rights. They cut unemployment. They blocked put more restrictions on unions. It was already a right to work state. They went after, they wouldn't advance the living wage, even though 79% of North Carolinians want a living wage. And then during Holy Week, Monday, Thursday, they passed a bill entitled Senate Bill 666. The computer kicked it out.
666.
The computer named it. And that bill was changing about 40 areas of our voting laws. And then in April, they passed a bill, House Bill 589, and put the worst form of photo ID in the country. At that point, though we had tried to meet with them, we had put thousands of people in the street, they weren't listening. We said if they're going to crucify the sick, crucify gay people, crucify the broken people, crucify working people, crucify voting rights, every crucifixion needs a witness.
All right.
So around April 28th on a Monday, 17 of us went in to protest. They said we couldn't bring scripture on signs. They said we couldn't protest in the vestibule. They said we couldn't make any noise. We went in and we prayed. We read the Constitution. We read scripture. They arrested all of us.
Now, stop right there. They arrested everybody. They took you away in handcuffs also.
Took me away in handcuffs, 7 ministers, 10 other people, and a woman in a wheelchair who had cerebral palsy. And the next Monday, people showed up. We didn't even ask them.
Okay.
So it sowed a seed. And by the next week, hundreds of people were coming. By the end of the summer, thousands.
Sure.
Over 1,000 people got arrested that summer. Every Monday, protesting all of these things that they were doing. It became organized. In the 6th week, we found this out later, 6 weeks after we started, the governor, who was an extremist, whose poll numbers were at 50-some%, by the 6th week had dropped to under 40. He never recovered.
The power of the people is always greater than the people in power.
That's right. If you stay at it. And what's the genius of Moral Monday is it went on for 4 years. It wasn't just a one-time protest. Every Monday. Then we added to that a legal strategy. Now, when we started, we didn't have any lawyers, really.
Okay.
By the end of the summer, we had 120 lawyers giving free pro bono.
Wow.
They passed that extremist voter suppression law. They didn't do the 666 when they did the 589 and took a lot of things from the 666 one. We filed suit immediately. So we had a legal strategy. Then we had a voter registration strategy. In 2016, after almost 4 years, we beat them in court.
Okay.
We got this court to call what they were doing surgical racism. This court now, this Supreme Court. The governor got sent home. He lost. The gerrymandering laws have been overturned legally.
Okay, okay.
And we're poised in North Carolina to turn over the legislature.
With this midterm?
With this midterm.
Okay, okay.
But it was 4 years of constant action, organizing, legal strategy, and voting strategy all put together. Moral Monday was, if you will, though, the foundation.
All right.
Because it became for people like church, like social justice church.
Okay.
But it was church with Muslims, Christians, Jews, people who believe, people who don't believe,
Sure.
gay, straight, young,
Sure.
old, black, white, Asian, red, all people who saying, look, cutting people's health care is not left versus right, it's right versus wrong.
That's right. That's right.
Denying people their unemployment is right versus wrong.
Sure.
Denying people a living wage is right versus wrong. Taking people's voting rights is not a Democrat or Republican issue.
That's it.
It's a right versus wrong issue. And when we reframed the narrative, the extremists didn't know what to do. Because they couldn't say we were just Democrats.
Sure.
They couldn't say we were just, I mean, how do you say, I just cut 500,000 people's health care and it's the moral thing to do?
You don't.
You can't say it. It doesn't work.
No.
So we changed the narrative. And one of the things I'm arguing in this country, we are going to have to change the moral narrative because without moral imagination, you're never going to have moral action.
You have been quoted, sir, as saying that there are 5 diseases which threaten our democratic process: American democracy, systemic racism, unjust attacks on the poor, ecological devastation, the war economy, and Christian nationalism. So in the face of, you mentioned this court, and the move that's being made now, what do you think is going to happen with this whole FBI investigation for this one that's being investigated to sit on the highest court in the land?
Well, Nancy McLean has a book called Democracy in Chains, and you have to understand the extremists have wanted this court for years.
Yes.
They don't just want 5-4, they want 7-2. And you read that in her book. Because primarily what the court does is not just what it does on civil rights, but what it does on corporate rights. And the goal of many on the court is to make corporations, treat corporations like people and people like things, right? But the civil rights side of it is they want to roll back voting rights, roll back desegregation. Now here's how I would say about this court. Systemic racism for us means racist voter suppression, racist immigration laws, attacks on Native people, mass incarceration, resegregation of school. It's not Roseanne Barr calling somebody the N-word.
That's right.
I want to deal with systemic racism.
That's right.
Systemic poverty is there are 140 million poor people in this country, not 39 million. 140 million poor and low wealth people. 43% of this country's population. 73% of them are women and children, and the majority of them are white. And the majority of the people who vote bad policies that hurt poor people get elected through racialized voter suppression that goes after black people. Then when they get in office, they pass laws that hurt mostly white people.
The folk who put them in.
Right. So poor white people and black people got to come together.
Okay.
Ecological devastation. 4 million families can buy unleaded gas, can't buy unleaded water.
Jesus.
Right? A war economy where we're making a killing is making a killing.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
It's CEOs of defense companies make an average of $19 billion a year. The average, that CEO makes $19 million. The average combat soldier makes less than 30,000.
Wow.
And then this Christian nationalism that basically says we're going to pray, P-R-A-Y, for a president or a Congress that is praying, P-R-E-Y-I-N-G, on all the people that Jesus cared about. So here we got with Kavanaugh. No, first of all, he was guilty of assault before the sexual assault. What I mean by that, if you look at his rulings, he assaulted voting rights.
Yes.
All right.
And nobody's talking about that.
Right. He assaulted immigrant woman who wanted an abortion. She was with ICE. He wouldn't allow that. Not that I'm saying I'm agreeing with abortion one way or other, but I'm saying he went after this brown woman. He believed that federal government should be able to overturn local environmental regulation. So he was an assaulter. Before. now this accusation about assaulting a woman, sexually assaulting, is almost as though what they want on the court is someone who will abuse power.
Well, that's what we have.
He is an abuser of power. That's right.
So it's following.
It follows.
Yeah.
The danger of it is before this happened, they held this seat open for 400 days, longer than any time since the Civil War.
Sure.
And so I don't know what's going to happen. I think nothing's going to happen if people don't keep protesting and standing and fighting. But we need to say he's unfit for the sexual assault, the social assaults, the political assault, the civil rights. Exactly.
Listen, my brother, we are out of time, but let me say this. Dr. King, you were about 5 minutes.
Hello, Hofstra. How you doing? Good to be here. In the Small Monday movement, we have a phrase that says, forward together, not one step back. And when I say forward together, you would say not one step back. So you gotta stand up, this is movement. I'm not gonna sing. Forward together. Forward together. Forward together. All right, y'all are pretty good. Thank you. I'm honored to be here on this historic day. We remember the legacy of nonviolence, particularly as espoused by the Honorable Mahatma Gandhi, God rest his soul. I'm so thankful for those who've had anything to do with our invitation of being here tonight. I think I'm thankful. And the reason I say that is because have you all ever been backstage? Before you come out here, they have a head, just a head right here on the wall. It looks like a speaker that didn't do right. I'm gonna take a picture, but I'm telling you the truth. Now, I don't know if it's a real head or if it's a fake head, but it's a head. Now, y'all don't believe me. Come in, executive director. Come in. From Trinidad. I want them to know, am I lying? No, you're not. I'm not lying. So I've been trying, thank you so much. So I'm figuring out what in the world? Y'all cut off folks' heads. That's not nonviolent. So I'm kind of hoping that that's just some kind of stage prop or something. Because I was wondering what was going to happen to me if I didn't do the right thing. I want to take a few minutes, and then we're going to have this conversation. And I want to talk about if you knew why, you would know why. If you knew why we are where we are in this nation right now, you would know why this is the very moment that you must refuse to give up on this democracy. This moment we're in, my brothers and sisters, is really not about Russia. I don't know what Russia did. Maybe some folks, and it's not even so much about a certain person that used to put his name on towers and they claim he built it. Turn this up some of this mic so I can hear myself. It's really not about that. And I want to walk you back through some history. Now, what I'm going to talk about could easily be an entire semester that I've got to condense in a few minutes. But the first thing I want you to do is turn to your neighbor and say, stop saying. Tell them, say, stop saying. We've never seen this before. America has had at least 2 reconstructions. Now, the first one began 4 years after the end of the slavery in 1865, the end of the Civil War, when black and white people in the South, former slaves, free-issue black people, and poor white people found out that they were natural allies. And they had both been used by the bourbon class in the North and South who needed cotton to be king for their own economic interests. Beginning around 1865 after the war, they formed something called fusion coalitions. And those fusion coalitions, by 1868, controlled every Southern legislature in this country. Some of them were majority black. And by 1870, all of those states, North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, had rewritten constitutions that guaranteed equal rights, guaranteed public education, raised taxes to use that money to help restore what had been taken through slavery, put people on the courts that believed in justice for all people, and expanded voting rights. In fact, in North Carolina, the 1868 Constitution, when it was written by black and white people together, says all people endowed by the Creator certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, the enjoyment of the fruit of their own labor, and the pursuit of happiness. This is 1868. The 1868 Constitution in the first articles guaranteed equality, guaranteed public education as a right, something that's not even in the U.S. Constitution today. In 1868, before the 14th Amendment was fully ratified, in a southern state, they put this clause: the first duty of a civilized and Christian state is beneficent provisions for the poor. That's 1868. Now, but by 1877, the Bourbon class, the oligarch that had made all this money off of slavery, could not stand to see this fusion of black and white people coming together. And so they launched a systemic attack. The first thing they went after in 1868 was health care. They rolled back the freedmen's hospitals that were providing free health care for blacks and poor whites, post-slavery. And some of the writings suggest that the reason they did that, they said, why would we want to keep people alive who will vote against us? I didn't say that was in 2017, I said that was in 1868. They closed all the freedmen hospitals except two. One was at Barber. They removed the Freedmen Bureau that was supposed to do what General Sherman had promised, that every African American would get 40 acres and a mule. And those African Americans were beginning to work with black people. I know that because my heritage is black, white, and Tuscarora Indians, and I come out of that tradition of blacks and mulatto people working together in the South. By 1877, they had retaken over state legislatures through violence, through Jim Crow, through gerrymandering, and through voter suppression. By 1877, the number one thing the extremists were running on was, we have to cut taxes. And the reason they wanted to cut taxes was because they did not want the government to have the money to do the work it needed to do to deal with the aftermath of slavery. Even though slavery had been created by the government, they didn't want slavery, the effects of slavery, to be dealt with by the government. By 1877 and the 1880s, we have an economist back here, America kept going through recessions, up and down, all the way up to the late 1800s, 1900s. They also began to talk very viciously in their politics against anybody who was progressive. So, for instance, when the Klan was founded in 1872, it was first founded to attack white people who were working with black people. Language became very vile in politics. People were blamed based on race for the problems of the nation. And there were violent attacks against black and white people who were trying to move forward. between 1868 and 1877, they had a plan to take over the courts. Beginning at the state level, federal level, and then in 1877, a presidential candidate loses the popular vote but wins by the electoral college. You hear me, young folk? This is the benefit of going to class. Especially when people will teach you the truth. He gets elected, Rutherford B. Hayes, through a compromise, and the compromise was, you give me the presidency, I'll cut the taxes, I'll give you the Supreme Court, and I'll give you the South. By 1883, the Civil Rights Act of 1875 is overturned. Because in 1875, discrimination and racism was illegal federally. It's a federal offense. That's why Dr. King in 1963 says, 50 years ago, and then he says, but 100 years later, the Negro is still not free. He knew this history. He knew this history. 1883, the Supreme Court that has been put in place through this deconstruction of Reconstruction overturned all the civil rights laws. 1896, the Supreme Court is stacked with 8 extremists. 8 that began being put on the court with this guy who got elected or selected by the Electoral College. And those 8 justices voted that separate but equal is constitutional. And there's only one dissent, Justice Harlan from Kentucky. He's white, he chooses to dissent. He's the only one because they had stacked the courts. And by 1898, riots were starting all over the country, rioting to kick black and white progressives out of office, killing the blacks, running the whites out. The first one is in November 10th, 1898, a coup d'etat where black and white people in Wilmington were run out of town. And black people were killed. More people were killed in Wilmington, some say, per capita than were killed, percentage-wise, than were killed on 9/11. 3 to 5% of the entire city was murdered on November 10th, 1898. The mulatto son of a white governor, his son, who was the child of a black woman who ran the local black newspaper, was run out of town and his newspaper was burnt down. Which from 1896 to 1921, black people were killed, a black man was hung on an average of 1 per day. And by 1901, 1901, the last African American that had been placed in the United States Congress by election was expelled, George White. And by 1902, the Congress was all white and all male. And white supremacy was back in its place. Woodrow Wilson gets elected in 1914, and he plays Birth of a Nation, the movie that honored the Ku Klux Klan in the Oval Office 100 years before Steve Bannon was ever there. Hear me now. Hear me now. He ends desegregation of the federal government. He kicks black folk out of his office that were trying to, because see, Rutherford B. Hayes was a Republican, Woodrow was a Democrat. So both sides are getting it wrong. And in 1919, the statue where people were killed around in Charlottesville was commissioned not to honor the Civil War. Because 96% of the statues that were put up in the Confederate didn't honor the Civil War, because Robert E. Lee he didn't even believe in it. He was a general. And it was treason back then. Those statues, 90% of them were put up between 1896 and 1920 to pay homage to the return of white supremacy. And if you know that history, maybe you know why they marched around the statue a few years ago in Charlottesville. They were not marching around that statue about the Confederacy. They were marching because they believed, Richard Spencer, the white supremacist that led them, that now in the occupant of the White House, white supremacist and white nationalist policies have returned to the White House. You can't understand where we are without understanding that moment. But there's a second moment, a second Reconstruction. 1954, Thurgood Marshall, with Jewish, white, and black lawyers, building on the dissent of Justice Harlan, the dissent that was used by Charles Hamilton Houston, who goes to a failing law school, Howard University, and revives it with the goal of creating social engineers. That's what he said lawyers ought to be. They fight for 50-some years to overturn Plessy. Case after case, strategy after strategy. And in 1954, an all-white Supreme Court, once again, with one member who was an avid member of the KKK, is forced to vote 9-0, saying that separate but equal was unconstitutional. The first riots about that happened up here in New York. It didn't happen in the South. So don't you northern folk think that Reagan and Justice Sutherland. Emmett Till is killed August 28, 1955 in response to what is going on. The Montgomery Bus Boycott starts that same year. Rosa Parks is responding to the death. And talk about nonviolence. Rosa Parks said, I'm going to respond to the death of Emmett Till, not by burning my own community or killing other people, but by engaging in a nonviolent civil disobedience act in the Deep South. She stood up, she sat down, we stood up, and from 1954 forward, you have the modern day civil rights movement. Then Kennedy gets elected in 1960, and Kennedy gets elected though by putting a segregationist on his ticket, Lyndon Baines Johnson, and Lyndon Baines Johnson helps him carry the certain parts of the South. And Kennedy wins by less than 1 vote per precinct in the country. Kennedy wins against Nixon, right? And that's in the 1960s. The Dixiecrats, who were kind of the cousins, if you will, of the deconstructionists from the 1800s, Strom Thurmond and people like that, decide we need a plan. So they began a new plan, a new form of deconstruction. Because they said, we'll never win if black and white people come together and even if they have to put a segregationist on the ticket and vote for these people who are going to then push civil rights laws, even though reluctantly Kennedy did it because of how he got elected. And so they began to put in place something called a white Southern strategy, which they knew would work in the South, but it would also work in the racial enclaves of the North. What did the white Southern strategy attack first? Voting rights. Public education. They started hollering again about cutting taxes. Because they wanted to undermine the ability of the government to put in place the programs and fund them that would overcome the legacy of Jim Crow. They started a vicious campaign. Whites that stood with blacks were ostracized and labeled. The KKK and other groups began vicious attacks all over the country. They started going after the courts. They attacked people. And by 1968, Martin is dead, Mega's dead, Malcolm is dead, so many are dead. 1965, August 6, 1965, the Voting Rights Act is passed, and Lyndon Baines Johnson himself said, I fear we have just given away the South for 40 years. For 40 years. At least. Riots break out. Black and minority people, the rioting is used as an excuse to come after people violently. Vietnam is happening. George Wallace runs twice. He plays Trump before Trump played Trump. He became a governor whose vicious, Dr. King said, a governor whose lips are dripping with the words of interposition and nullification. That's what Dr. King described in 1963, the March on Washington, because he stood up and said segregation yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And he said it in a way as a high government official that gave license. And when he said it, when he opened his mouth and talked vile and vicious with the media, by the end of that year, he started in January with this, and he was just a governor, with this vicious language, this polarizing racist language. And by the end of that year, Medgar Evers was dead. 4 girls in a church were dead, and the president was dead, and the next year civil rights workers would be dead. Black and white would be dead. And you can trace it back almost to his mouth. Hear what I'm saying? Now this is 1963, 1964. And Kevin Phillips, and so George Wallace comes to New York in Madison Square Garden, and he gives a speech that if you Google it tonight, students and others, and read that speech, if you close your eyes, it sounds eerily familiar. Get him out of here with his hippie self. Somebody ought to knock him out. He said that. I got the blacks. There's a black over there that's with me. He said that in Madison Square Garden. And when George Wallace won, he won in the North and in the South. He almost won the president. And one writer said he became the greatest loser of all time because he showed how race and racial division can be used to split black and poor white people and Latinos who ought to be allies, particularly the poor and working poor. And it was a powerful tool, except you had to do it a little bit smoother and a little bit more gentile than Wallace. And so Kevin Phillips went to Richard Nixon and said, I know how we can win. We can exploit racial fear and economic fear, and we can come up with a campaign that doesn't sound racist, but it causes racial division to flourish. And Kevin Phillips, in fact, later on somebody would actually say what it was, and it was used by Nixon, Reagan, Bush, all of them. It was, first of all, we say we're against forced busing, we're against government intervention, we're for states' rights, we're against entitlements. We racialize all of the social programs that help poor whites come up out of the Depression. We racialize them and make people think those programs are the problem, are the cause of their problems. And then we get real technical. We don't say the N-word, we don't do that anymore. We say we're fighting for tax cuts. But when you look at the program, all of the policies hurt black people and brown people and poor whites the most. But the language, the narrative is so deceptive that it pits white people against black people. And it divides people enough that we can control the 13 southern states. And if we can control that and build on it, we will eventually be able to control the presidency and the Supreme Court. What you see now is a 50-year plan coming to fruition. 1968 was the beginning of it. And Richard Nixon won using that. And it's been a playbook ever since. And the goal of the courts has been there ever since. Because they knew that if they could control 13 southern states from Maryland to Texas, do you realize this is what they did? If we control 13 southern states from Maryland to Kentucky, we control 171 plus electoral votes in a race to 270. If we can control those southern states, we can control 31% of the members of the House of Representatives, which means we only need 20% from the other 37 states. We can control 26 members of the United States Senate, which means we only need 25 from the other 37 states for a majority. And if we play that in the South and in the racial enclaves of the Rust Belt, the Midwest, the Wheat Belt, and the North, we can pick off enough And we won't sound racist per se, because at the core of every one of the plans of deconstruction, if you go back and read the history, there was a theme: elect us and we'll make America great again. That was language that was used in the 1800s. This language was used in the 1968. And so what we see now, Neil Painter, great historian at Princeton University, said, if you don't understand, number one, this that we're seeing now was planned. This that we're seeing now is the iconography of a too often repeated episode in the American project. We move forward a little bit and then we move backwards. What scared the extremists was not President Obama. It was the electorate that elected President Obama that broke through in Florida and North Carolina and Virginia and had the potential to disrupt the Solid South. And the fear behind much of this is the coming demographics in America of 2042, when it's 33, 33, 33, there's no clear majority. And so what you have is an extremist ideology that is trying to delay a future that cannot be denied. So that's why you can't say this is just about Trump. Trump is, he is the symptom of a greater moral malady, right? He's like, you know, when you sneeze, that ain't the cold, that's the symptom. The stuff that comes out when you sneeze, that is not the cold. You wipe that, you don't treat that. You want the cold to go away, you got to go deeper. Yeah. Y'all get my drift? And it's not just him. He wouldn't be there if they had not done deep work in state houses and taken over state houses and controlling election boards and controlling the Congress, because he couldn't do a thing but run his mouth. It's the Congress didn't enable him. That's why anybody that makes the mistake and say, if we just remove Trump, things will be better, you do not understand how we got here. But if you knew why we came here, you would know why we cannot give up on this democracy. And we've got to organize and vote like never before. Now, I would mention to you there have only been 2 times in history. I can't stay on that history, so it could take me a whole semester. But there have only been 2 times in history when we've had a president selected that wasn't elected by the majority vote, and both times it turned out bad. 1877 was supposed to be Hayes, 2000 was Bush. Hayes leads us into one thing, Bush leads us into war. We should not have gone into. We have now 4 members of the Supreme Court that will be nominated, will be 5, I think, if Kavanaugh goes through, by presidents that didn't receive the popular vote. But now, what else happened? Well, before Trump, part of what was going on in this Southern strategy that began in 1868 and kept coming, I believe, in the election of President Obama and the electorate of President Obama, it represented the birth pains of a third Reconstruction. But the deconstructors knew it was happening. That's why they're fighting so hard to keep it to come to fruition. So what did they begin to do? Before Trump ever ran, in 2010, 26 states passed voter suppression laws. 26 states where it represents 54% of all African American voters. Now, in those states, what is interesting about that, my brothers and sisters, that every state that passed voter suppression laws, they are also the poorest states. They are also the states with the least amount, with the lowest wages and the lowest unions and the greatest amount of people that need health care and the greatest amount of child poverty and the greatest attacks on immigrants and the LGBT community and women. So there is this direct line that we don't often talk about because we think voting rights is just a black issue, but the reality is, in those 26 states, the candidates that use voter suppression are mostly extremist Tea Party whites. I don't call them Republicans or Democrats because they're not acting like really either. They get elected by racialized voter suppression, by what they call bleaching the black vote or stacking the black vote. Bleaching means taking it out of certain communities so that black and white people can't form coalitions to elect candidates of their choice. Stacking the black vote means putting 80–90% black vote in one area, thereby disempowering the power of the black vote to connect with black and white people and Latino people to elect candidates of their choice. And but they get elected through racialized voter suppression. But here's the thing. Once they get elected, most of the bills they pass hurt white people. Stop saying this is the worst thing we've ever seen. It's not worse than what happened in 1877 and 1898. It's not worse than the death that happened due to the Civil Rights Movement. It is not worse than slavery. It is not worse than the Holocaust. It is not worse than women not having the right to vote. It is not worse than the riots that took place when people were simply fighting for union and a minimum wage. It is not worse. It is just our time, and it's time for us to take it on, because if our parents could do more with less, we can surely do more with more. If we understand voting, we must understand, we must fight not just for this, we got to fight this midterm, but we've also got to fight to change some things. We must fight to restore the Voting Rights Act. And we must call those who stand against restoration of the Voting Rights Act what we call Strom Thurmond. When Strom Thurmond only filibustered the 1957 Civil Rights Act for one day, we called him a racist. Ryan, McConnell, and Boehner have resisted fixing the Voting Rights Act for 5 years. When the Supreme Court granted it, they sent it to the Congress, said, you fix it. They have sat on it for 5 years. If we call Strom Thurmond a racist because he blocked fixing the Civil Rights Act for 24 hours, then forget what Roseanne Barr said. That's not real racism. Forget people that told somebody the N-word. That ain't a lot of people. The real racism we ought to be dealing with is the folk that never call you the N-word, but every day they put on a suit and have politics that hurt black, brown, red, yellow, and blue. Policy violence. We must fight to have voting as a holiday. We must fight to have early voting and same-day registration, something you don't even have in New York. And New York ought to be shamed that North Carolina has early voting and same-day registration in the Deep South. And all you good progressive folk up here, we need to push for automatic registration at 18. If you make me register for war at 18, I'll have to be automatically registered for vote at 18. We must stop extreme photo ID laws that block people. We must ask for we must have protection systems with backup. Because of these computer glitches, we've got to have a paper trail somewhere that we know what's going on. And when we can, we must cease the electoral college, because America is supposed to be a democracy. One man, one woman, one vote. No electoral college that most of us can't get admitted to should elect who is the president of these United States. There's something else we must do. Having a villain is not enough to save the heart and soul of a country. Not a part of it happens to save the heart. We need a vision. And I believe the greatest way to build that vision, we're trying to do it now, is with the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. Because we believe there are 5 interlocking injustices that we must address. And if we don't, the question is not, can a party survive? The question is, can America survive? That issue is systemic racism, as it is seen through the lens of voter suppression, mass incarceration, the attacks on immigrants, and the attacks on First Nation Native people who came here before all of us. The second issue is systemic poverty. There are 140 million poor people in this country today, 50 years after the vision of poor people. We've got 140 million. In 2016, 51% of our children under the age 18 were poor. That's 38 million children. 40% of adults, that's 81 million adults. 42% of our elders, that's 20 million elders. 45% of women and girls, that's 73.5 million people. 33% of white people live in poverty, that's 67 million. 60% of black people, that's 25 million. 25 million. But there are 32 million, almost more, white people who live in poverty and low wealth. Now, when I say poverty and low wealth, I'm not just talking about homeless. I'm talking about people who would be poor if they didn't have some assistance, and I'm talking about the folk that make less than a living wage, as denoted by the Institute for Policy Studies. We have 65% of Latinos living in poverty, that's 37 million people, and 41% of Asian people, that's 7.6. And you cannot, 7.6 million, you cannot have 140 million people in a wealthiest nation of the country living in poverty, 43.5% of your country. 1 to 2% of the population controlling the vast majority of wealth. 400 families making an average of $97,000 an hour while we lock people up who simply want $15 an hour. 3 people owning more than 260 million people. You can't have that kind of greed and at the top of a pyramid and think the bottom is not going to implode. We also have to address racism, systemic racism and poverty together. You can't separate. Somebody say, is it race or is it class? Say it is. And we have to address ecological devastation. We cannot live in a culture that is constantly warming up the climate, because last time I checked, the only place we can stay is Earth. I don't think they got any parts on Mars yet. We cannot, 4 million families can buy unleaded water and can't buy unleaded gas and can't buy unleaded water. It's not just Flint, right? We have drilling going on First Nation property and reservation where their aquifers are being drilled on and being poisoned, and then the aquifers on the reservation are running to the aquifers outside the reservation. So the companies basically do it on the reservation thinking they're just poisoning the native people, but aquifers run and then they end up poisoning surrounding country. I know I've been there in Arizona on the Apache reservation to see what happened. But also we got to address the war economy. Nearly 60 cents of every discretionary dollar is going to war, while less than 15, 17 cents is going to public education and health care. Every country that we have attacked since World War II has been a predominantly black and brown country. We got a new draft in this country, it's called the poverty draft. People go in because they're poor. CEOs of military defense companies make an average of $19 million a year, while the average combat soldier makes less than $30,000 a year. And some of them, when they come back, have to get food stamps. The war economy. More people dying from suicide in the war economy than for combat. And then we have to address this immoral Christian nationalism and religious nationalism that tries to suggest that God, all God cares about is, do you hate gay people? Do you hate abortion? Do you want prayer in the school? Do you believe in tax cuts? Do you believe in guns? And do you agree with extreme Zionism that would put people like Palestinians in a type of modern day apartheid? Now, I know that ain't the God of Scripture. Because the God of Scripture said, when I was hungry, when I was naked, when I was a stranger, did you bring me in? And as much as you've done it unto the least of these, you've done it unto me. The God I serve says that when politicians, Ezekiel 22, uses their power to hurt the poor and the least of these, that those politicians are acting like rabies-infested wolves who devour the poor. That's what the scripture says. Jesus said we must preach good news to the poor. The poor in Luke 4 is protokos. It means those who've been made poor because of economic exploitation of Caesar-like narcissistic, egotistical leaders. dangerous for this democracy. People have a right to believe what they want to believe, but they don't have a right to do it without a challenge. And it is dangerous to have people going into our Congress, but with our president, who pray for his success, pray for him to be successful. I don't care if he's Democrat or Republican. They P-R-A-Y, pray for him, while his policies are P-R-E-Y-I-N-G on the most hurtful people. And it can't just be a moral critique of Republicans. We have to have a moral critique of Democrats too. Because too often, Democrats don't do what they ought to do. Republicans do too much of what they shouldn't do. We need a moral narrative that says, when you wake up in
water seeps through the air, drawing circles in the dirt. Sunshine breathing life in colors, calibrating temperature, growing roots from the center of the sphere, glowing green and air is clear, spinning clouds like wheels, weaving words like silk, locking stories in the air, frozen melodies everywhere, holding words from your lips. I don't disagree.